Officer at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, based here in Washington, D.C. And I am going to kind of just take you through my small career story over the next 15 minutes. And I like to say it's a tale of me kind of leapfrogging through life. I've done a lot of jumps from one field to another. So that is what this is going to be oriented towards. And I'm really looking forward to this discussion and your questions and having a really candid conversation with you all. So without further ado, let me just move on. Okay, so first and foremost, I am from Texas, born and raised. I'm from San Antonio specifically. I graduated Ronald Reagan High School in 2009, which feels like a lifetime ago. And from there, I went to Boston University, and that's a picture of me with my mom and brother at my graduation. I majored in psychology. I was the first in my family to leave the state and pursue college out of state. So it was like a really crazy different kind of college experience for me, and knew that I wanted to pursue a career in psych. And so I was looking through different graduate programs and how I could continue on doing like research and some of the less clinically oriented work in psychology. And at that time, I kind of had this dream of like going into academia and kind of being a professor one day. And so I, looked back and I saw that UTSA had this really great grad program for experimental psychology. And so that is where I did my, that's me. I am presenting one of my master's theses for the graduate program. And while there, it was kind of like a really foundational experience for me. I loved the program, loved what, everything that it had to offer. And one of the biggest points for me was I was a TA, so I was a teaching assistant during my time in the program. And that was kind of where I got my love for public policy, interestingly, and how I kind of decided that I wanted to make the pivot from doing academic-oriented research to kind of more public policy-oriented research. And so, it was a combination of throughout my time in undergrad and grad school, I had, faced a lot of different challenges and barriers to higher education that I thought were interesting and should seem to lead to pretty basic policy solutions that weren't happening. And I was curious how to enter into that spectrum of how do we address these challenges on a national level, on a state level, how do we create change? And I, had just gotten a experimental psych degree, which is not a public policy degree. And so at the time, academia is what I had known. It was what I was accustomed to. And so I thought, okay, well, how do I make this leap into public policy? I guess I can just keep going to more grad school. So I then applied to the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign to do a PhD in education policy through their College of Education there as a way to hopefully transition into policy. And while there, I worked at the Office of Community College Research and Leadership. That's me. It was the first time I had my name on a door. So that's the only photo I have from my time at University of Illinois. And it was a great program and I love my advisor, but it still was a very academically focused program. And it was still not exactly the on the ground public policy work that I, had a passion for, that I was really interested in, that I wanted to learn more about. And so a friend of mine at the time told me about this organization called the Congressional Hispanic Caucus Institute. And they do a series of internships and fellowship programs where they will actually provide money to come to DC and work for offices on Capitol Hill or in different departments. So like Department of Energy, Department of Agriculture, Department of Housing, or different think tanks or public policy organizations. So, the places that develop a lot of the research that gets utilized in the city. And so it seemed like a great opportunity. And so I applied to their graduate fellowship program and decided to take a year off from my PhD, kind of like a one-year sabbatical, and just do the fellowship program so that I could get a lot more on-the-ground experience. And so that was part of my transition into where I am now. So, the CHCI is this great organization, like I said, that really focuses on bringing Latinx students in particular into DC, because the diversity pipeline into the different public policy spaces here can be very lacking. And so, you know, they try to really fix that by taking folks from all over the country, from all different backgrounds, to occupy these spaces. And so what I got to do as a graduate fellow, I applied to work with Senator Patty Murray from Washington State on the Senate Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions. And I worked on committee staff for her. So, you know, folks have their personal offices that do a lot of the constituent type oriented work and state or district based work. And I worked on committee for her. So my job was solely focused on education policy and combing through all the different bills and laws that come through on ed policy and working with the Department of Education on different issues at the time. And I fell in love with the work, and the pace of the Hill was overwhelming and crazy, and was really kind of more in line with what I wanted to do. And so halfway through the program, I made the absolutely crazy decision to drop out of my PhD program. I did the thing that like everyone tells you not to do. And so I wrote my advisor back and said that I wasn't going to be returning to my PhD program, and I was going to try my hand at policy work in DC and see if I could continue working here and get jobs here. So thankfully, that worked out. And so when I finished up my fellowship on Capitol Hill working with Senator Murray, I had an opportunity to work for the Education Trust, which is a really great public policy think tank advocacy organization. And they do a lot of work focused on education specifically, and more specifically than that, focus on students of color and low-income students and how to reduce inequities in the education system for that population. Really loved the work I did there with them, and it was like my first kind of step and transition into the think tank space in DC, which is very you know, it's a huge network and really complicated, and something I had never heard of until I started working on the Hill. I had no idea what think tanks even were. I thought that they did like a lot of like math, which they do, but it's really a lot different than that. And so I really enjoyed the experience, but I was a research analyst for the Education Trust working on higher education. And again, it was a lot more research focused. It was more data oriented, less about the policy development and writing and advocacy work. And so I was kind of thinking through, okay, how can I turn this position into one where I can do more of that type of thinking and work? And thankfully, grabbed a coffee with Ben Miller, who is the Vice President of Higher Education Policy at the Center for American Progress, which is one of the biggest progressive think tanks here in Washington, D.C. And he mentioned that he was going to have an opening on the team popping up. And so I was at the Education Trust for 9 months, and then made the leap and made the transition, which is actually not uncommon in D.C. I was mortified when I was going through it at the time, because, you know, I had always kind of learned and heard that you need to like stick with something for as long as possible before really making any kind of leap or transition. But I had a lot of really great mentors at the time who recommended for me to just like take that opportunity, especially because it was a job that was in line with what I really wanted to do. So did that, and went to Center for American Progress. And there I got to do a lot of cool research and policy development work. So I started off as a research associate at CAP, and wrote a bunch of policy briefs and reports, and basically utilized publicly available data to, you know, kind of build a story for policymakers and for, you know, the general public on what are some of the biggest equity issues facing higher education students today. And so got to, you know, highlight those problems. I wrote about college spending and how we spend disproportionately less on students of color than we do white students in higher education, just like in K-12. One of my favorite projects that I did at CAP was writing about the NCAA and highlighting some of the inequities that exist within that system. I got to talk about affirmative action, free college, free community college, different programs that could help make college more affordable for students of color. I got to write op-eds for different like magazines and news outlets. So I got to do some for like Fortune, Business Insider, and this is one that I got to do related to my NCAA work on unionization within the NCAA. My favorite thing that I got to do while I was at CAP is we actually have a employees union. And so I was elected to be the president of our union at CAP. We have like about 100 or so junior staff at the time. And so I got to represent them to our president and general counsel and negotiate a contract, and, really fight for higher wages, like better benefits, different protections for staff, and kind of got to utilize all of the policy experience I had built up to that time in a real world applicable way that had, tangible impact on my coworkers. And it was so challenging and terrifying, but really, really great and fun experience. One that I'll never forget for sure. And then, I got to have a few different roles at CAP, thankfully. And so the last role that I had, I was a higher education research and advocacy manager. So basically kind of half of my time was dedicated to doing those policy briefs and research, and then the other half of my time was specifically dedicated to going to Capitol Hill and advocating for policy solutions that we had been working on to Hill staff there, and trying to work with them on different ways that we could incorporate some of our policy solutions into different bills or proposals or different types of actions that could be taken legislatively to help make this system better. And so, really, really loved that work. It was super interesting and always challenging and always different. But one of my friends about a year ago was working at the Bill Melinda Gates Foundation, and she was actually leaving to go to grad school. And she was leaving an opening there and had recommended that I apply to fill her position. And at the time, I didn't even think about leaving CAP or dabbling in philanthropy, but kind of realized that at the time I had legislative experience working on Capitol Hill. I had gotten the public policy think tank experience. The only thing that I really hadn't been exposed to as much was philanthropy. And philanthropy plays a major role in how policy development happens in DC and across the country generally, because places like the Gates Foundation provide the funding to organizations like CAP and Education Trust and New America and all these different think tanks all over the place to do that thinking and policy research and policy development. And I had joked with the foundation when I first joined that they had actually been indirectly paying my salary since I got to DC, because they sponsored my fellowship through CHCI. My salary at CAP was actually paid through the Bill Melinda Gates Foundation. So they might as well make it official and put me on the payroll officially. And thankfully they did. So that led to where I am now, which is the Bill Melinda Gates Foundation. And we're most well known for our global work. So we do a lot of work in the global health space, vaccine development, obviously now, especially in light of COVID, a lot of malaria, polio, like women's health and women's reproductive health all across the globe. But I work on the North America team specifically. So what I focus on is domestic policy. And what that looks like at the foundation is less policy development and more of working and partnering with various organizations, both in DC, but all across the country, that are doing the work, that are doing the thinking, the writing, the advocating for policy solutions to really address the vast inequities that we have in the system, and utilizing our grant dollars to try and drive that change and to ensure that we're thinking critically, that we're being responsive to the current moment, and that we are finding ways to be innovative in solutions to everyday problems, both new and the ones that have been here for a long time. So that is a very, very quick overview of the work that I do and the work that I've done. And I am, very, very interested and excited to, hear questions and answer, any thoughts or whatever you have, and looking forward to the conversation.